What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and in this video, I'm going to point out all the ways in which the killers in Scream 6 give themselves away early on. This is a bit of a comprehensive and analytical challenge, but technically, figuring out the killers is something that anyone can do, as long as you apply the theory of the predictive killer edit. If you want a better understanding of what a predictive killer edit is, as well as all of the character types around it, I recommend you check out my previous video on the subject, where I did a detailed analysis of all the different clues to look out for in the first 5 movies. Also, if you're new to the channel and interested in these kind of deep dives into the Scream franchise, go ahead and hit that subscribe button with those bell notifications turned on. That way, you can stay up to date on all the useless trivia there is to know about the Ghostface killers and any other horror movie icons. With that said, we're going to examine all of the characters in Scream 6 through the same character type metric that we used last time in order to whittle down the list of suspects by process of elimination. Obviously, hindsight is 2020, as we already know who the killers are, but the purpose of this metric is to prepare us for the upcoming sequel, because not every killer in the Scream franchise is exactly alike, and therefore each character type possesses their own distinct qualities that give them away as the killer. These 7 character types include the red herring, the hero, the confidant, the devil's advocate, the apathetic friend, hidden in plain sight, and the wild card. But I'm also going to include a new category, which I'm calling the opening scene victim, as Scream 6 definitely sets a precedence for potential plot twists in future installments. More on that later. Starting with the red herring type though, this is a very specific character in each movie, and while the definition of a red herring on its own is a misleading clue, it takes on more of a functional role as a character, since by design, these people never actually turn out to be the killer. This is because they are deliberately written to be transparent, overtly suspicious, and will display an over-the-top negative tone, which always remains consistent throughout the movie. However, while there are some instances in Scream 6 where red herrings are used as devices to throw the audience off track, none of the characters really possess the traits of this category, which makes Scream 6 the first movie in the franchise that doesn't actually contain a proper red herring character. I know a lot of people might consider Kirby to be one because of the lie we're told about her being dismissed from the FBI, but this is a very last-minute complication that isn't revealed to us until we're already well into the 3rd act. Had Kirby been consistently portrayed as sneaky, aloof, and collectively disliked by the other characters, that would be a different story, but she receives a positive tone and plenty of complex development in her scenes, which doesn't make her very befitting of this category. For the hero character type, these are your main protagonists, whose perspective is mostly what we see the movie through. More importantly though, they're the characters who drive their own storyline and are shown to be positively toned, regardless of whether or not they turn out to be the killer. Sam would obviously fill this role in Scream 6, as the plot is primarily concerned with not only exploring her feelings, but also the way in which they influence the course of the movie through the choices she makes in response to them. I considered including Tara in this category as well, but the reason she ultimately doesn't fit this character type is due to the fact that she spends most of the movie figuratively tethered to her sister. Even when she isn't though, Tara is otherwise highlighted by her budding romance with Chad, which has very little impact on the overall murder mystery. We do sometimes get to see her perspective, and she is given agency to make her own decisions, but this is still entirely done within the action of following Sam's storyline. With that said, the key factor in identifying whether the hero is going to be the killer is if we as an audience experience a lack of empathy for them. Think of Jill in Scream 4. Her character is all tell but no show. She explains numerous times how difficult it is for her to process the events going on around her, but it's always the other characters who project these emotions for her, while Jill herself often exits the scene and never really receives a private moment to herself where she isn't interacting with somebody else. If Sam as the hero were ever to be the killer, I would fully expect this same type of treatment, where she acts as sort of a blank slate while the other characters fill in the gaps in between. However, since Sam is dimensionalized through the way she challenges and overcomes obstacles from her very first appearance in the movie, it leaves very little room to misinterpret her intentions. As Sam is also a returning character, and this applies to all returning characters, the signs we should be looking out for is a contradiction in tone and behavior from the previous movie. Since Sam is still very much aligned with her characterization from Scream 5, it immediately lets us know that we shouldn't expect to see her reveal revealed as Ghostface anytime soon. Now, I'm just going to quickly jump to the wild card, as this is a very rare category for which only 3 characters in the franchise have previously been classified under. Typically, these are characters who either seem aimless in terms of which type they fall under, or have a very undefined relationship to the movie's heroes, as they often have very little shared screen time with them, or might not even encounter them at all until the climax. This is usually a result of last-minute script rewrites if we are dealing with a very rushed production, and since it is rumored that Kirby's role was originally meant to belong to Sydney, that could give Kirby this designation. However, Kirby has a very defined relationship to Sam from her first appearance on screen, so I'm going to go ahead and say that there are actually no wildcard characters in Scream 6 either. However, because the character types are much less scattered here, this actually makes the process of figuring out the killers a lot easier, since it significantly narrows down the list of traits we'll need to be looking out for. This will definitely help us when it comes to the Confidant, who is a supporting character that is directly linked to, and almost entirely defined by their relationship to either the hero or somebody the hero is close to. These characters also tend to have a very submissive role in that relationship, as their main function in the plot is to simply exist in it, where they may react to a decision made by the hero or become the reason our hero is forced to make a decision. The Scream 6 characters who fall under this are Tara Carpenter, Gale Weathers, Kirby Reed, Chad Meeks, Danny Brackett, and lastly, Quinn Bailey. Typically, if one of the Confidants is going to turn out to be the killer, it needs to be established that they share a complex, overarching narrative with the hero, which in simpler terms means that their relationship should become more complicated with every new scene that they appear together in. And while most of the Confidants are defined by their relationship to the hero, your Confidant killer will actually be defined in spite of this relationship. For example, the way that Billy and Richie are shown to exist autonomously outside of their connections with Sydney and Sam. Tara absolutely checks off both of these boxes, as not only does her relationship with Sam receive a lot of complex development, but she's also shown to yearn for independence, which is a very integral part of her character arc. However, while these factors do add the kind of texture needed to build a well-developed killer, the reason Tara could never be revealed as one here is due to her consistently positive tone. If Tara were to be disliked or come under suspicion by other trustworthy characters, or even act two-faced towards her sister in any way, that would definitely be a red flag. However, she's portrayed consistently with her appearance in Scream 5, so much so that her role as the Confidant in that movie hits a lot of the same beats, so it really becomes a case of trusting the characters who prove themselves time and again. Another key factor in being able to write off a character as the killer can be gleaned by the timing of their entrance into the story. In the previous 5 movies, the killer was always a character who made their initial appearance on screen in the first act, meaning any character introduced in Act 2 and onwards is unlikely to be the killer. Where an act ends and begins is always open for debate, but I personally separate them based on the plot reaching its peak escalation of action, which for Scream 6 would occur right after the attack in the bodega. As Gale doesn't make her first appearance on screen until well after this point in the movie, it likely means that she can be ruled out as a suspect. Further to that, Gale is obviously a returning character, and even though she contradicts her previous sentiments in regards to not writing a book about the events of Scream 5, she's still consistent in the tone and behavior that we've seen from her over the last 27 years of the franchise. When it comes to Kirby, these same rules can be applied, as she's both a character who was introduced in the second act and is also returning from a previous movie. However, I would say that Kirby's edgier personality here is very far removed from what her characterization was in Scream 4, which could be seen as a discrepancy that would move her to the top of the suspect list. However, taking into consideration that a lot can change in a person's life in 12 years, coupled with the fact that Kirby literally gets to explain her history and how it affected her life, it presents just the right kind of complex development the character would need in order to justify any inconsistency in her attitude. As I also mentioned earlier, Kirby is well liked by the other characters, with the exception of Gale and Bailey, and while While her rivalry and banter with Gale hits more of a comedic beat, similar to Dewey and Kincaid in Scream 3, Detective Bailey's suspicion of her comes from completely out of the blue, as Kirby hadn't actually given anybody a reason not to trust her at that point. That really says more about Bailey as a character, which I'll explain more when we get to him, but I think the biggest sign of Kirby's positive tone should be recognized from her introduction into the film, as it's accompanied by a somewhat heroic musical cue.
Special Agent Kirby Reed, FBI. I work out of the Atlanta office.
That, along with the revelation of a shared history with Sam, and the fact that she champions her innocence, should be enough information to psychologically let us know that Kirby will not be the killer. When it comes to Chad, this is another no-brainer for a returnee, but he's probably the most well-liked character in the movie, as he receives a positive tone where he even follows through on his good-hearted intentions, as evidenced by his protective nature towards the group. Ironically, I classify Chad as an apathetic friend type in Scream 5, mostly due to his cavalier attitude towards Tara's attack, as he seemed to prioritize his relationship with Liv. However, while apathetic friends are always defined by their negative tone, Chad was an exception to this rule, as he did come off more positively toned for how he progressed throughout his arc, ultimately gaining concern for his own safety as well as his girlfriend's. As predicted, Chad did move up to a confidant role in Scream 6, so again, there's a consistency in his characterization that once more shows us that we can always trust the characters who prove themselves. As far as the new characters go, we don't actually learn very much about who Danny is outside of being Sam's boyfriend, meaning that his relationship to her is his most defining attribute. However, that in and of itself reveals a lot of information to us, since almost every scene they share becomes a conversation about whether or not Sam should trust him. Again, Danny is a very positively toned character, and like Chad, is able to back up his words with his actions. This is a similar arc to Derek's in Scream 2, where he never once gave Sydney a reason to doubt him. However, in that movie, Sydney waffled back and forth on her suspicions, while Sam in Scream 6 is a lot more decisive. In that way, both Danny and Derek existed as a prop in their stories, whose sole purpose was to serve as a lesson that the hero needed to learn or overcome. We'll never know if Sam's decision to turn Danny away ended up saving his life, but we should at least know that seeing only her side of this relationship means that his perspective isn't relevant to the overall story. Therefore, it leaves no room for a proper motive to be established if he were to be revealed as the killer. Quinn, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of this, as she compares and contrasts her relationship to the Carpenter sisters through her own personal backstory involving her family. This is an example of what I mean when I say that the confidant killer will be defined in spite of their relationship to the hero, as it creates an additional plot thread that deviates from the one that we're currently following. However, Quinn is kind of an underdeveloped character due to her limited screen time, which goes against the previous confidant killers, who both shared a complex, overarching narrative with the hero. I imagine if Quinn never faked her death in the second act, we would have seen her relationship with the sisters expand even further and more proportionately over the course of the movie. But in hindsight, it becomes apparent that the writers were expediting this process in order to accommodate the plot twist of her eventual fake-out kill. Regardless of her screen time, however, this revelation bears a similarity to Billy in Scream 1, where he casually brings up the memory of his mother skipping town. It's a very specific piece of information that isn't seemingly necessary for the audience to know about, so based on the fact that Quinn is the only new character that even reveals any sort of personal information, it should immediately let us know that she's the killer, since it's not really important for us to know anything about the non-killers outside of their current situation in the movie. The exception to this rule would be our red herring characters, as their purpose is to have some sort of misleading backstory, but Quinn is never presented with an over-the-top negative tone that a red herring would have, so it lets us know that the information she's telling us is going to be important later on. I should also point out how suspicious it is that her relationship with her father occurs completely off-screen, as we never see the two characters interact until the climax climax of the movie. With Quinn even explaining how important she is to her father, this is another example of the movie telling us rather than showing, which means that our perspective of the characters is purposefully being manipulated. This same principle can be applied to attacks and kills that appear off screen, as we should know by now that the killers of the past have employed this fake-out method in order to remove themselves from the suspect list. But despite these glaring red flags, Quinn's culpability as the killer can also be recognized psychologically. This is displayed by the inconsistency in her tone, as during the meeting in the park, she throws shade on Sam and the other survivors as being possible suspects. Of course, this could be looked at as fair play, since the core four acted as though they were exempt from the rules, but this comes immediately after Sam and Tara vouched for her as their roommate, and with Quinn correlating her arguments to the online rumors that were already established as one of our hero's obstacles, it's a noticeable shift from the positive tone that was displayed the night before. Next up is the Devil's Advocate, who is a character similar to the Confidant type, with the exception that rather than having a submissive role in their relationship to the hero, they're instead shown to be oppositional and have an agenda of their own that could create conflict. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're antagonistic, but they will definitely be outspoken in their opinions, influential of the other characters, and are likely to stir the pot if the situation calls for it. The Scream 6 characters who fall under this type are Mindy Meeks, Anika Kayoko, and our other two killers, Ethan Landry and Detective Bailey. A major trait belonging to the Devil's Advocate is that they are going to make an argument for why another character may or may not be the killer. In Mindy's case, they might even make an argument as to why every character might be the killer. Of course, Mindy is another returning survivor from the previous movie, so the same rules of consistency still apply and check out with her. But if the Devil's Advocate resorts to this type of conjectural finger pointing, the biggest red flag to look out for will be the character's intent behind it. If Mindy were pulling people aside to have these conversations one-on-one, or even pushing her perspective of a character that isn't shared by anyone else, it would suggest that she could be gaslighting and planting seeds of mistrust. However, everything Mindy says is in the service of educating the group so that they could all survive longer and hopefully solve the mystery. As the intent is altruistic rather than selfish, it should let us know that just like the other survivors, Mindy can be stricken from the list of suspects as well. Similar to Quinn's role, Anika is also another underdeveloped character with limited screen time, so it is kind of challenging when it comes to placing her under a character type. However, unlike Quinn, Anika has no defined relationship with Sam outside of the fact that they're in the same friend group. In some cases, this could designate Anika as a wild card, since her most prominent connection to the hero is through another supporting character. But I ultimately settled on Devil's Advocate, as the initiative and protectiveness she takes towards Tara during the party scene does imbue her with a sense of purpose in the Carpenter sisters' story. Still, based on this tenuous connection, I would say it's very unlikely that Anika would have turned out to be Ghostface, as the lack of building blocks for her character's foundation would have presented an unsatisfying and underwhelming killer reveal. On top of that, Anika also has a consistently positive tone, and during the scene in the park where the non-Core 4 characters are singled out as suspects, she's the only one of them who doesn't deflect the blame in a defensive or personal way, opting instead to point out the facts in a more practical and unemotional manner. Ethan could also be pigeonholed the same way as Anika, just due to the fact that his strongest connection to the group seems to be through Chad, but despite the fact that he's also underwritten in a lot of ways, he's still given many defining character traits that ultimately land him under the Devil's Advocate type. Particularly, Ethan is shown to argue the merits of self-preservation more than anyone else, even pointing out the flaws in the choices made by the other characters. This is nothing we haven't seen in the franchise before, but while these characters in the past have been decisive and followed through on their concerns, Ethan takes absolutely zero precautions and displays no agency in response to his trepidations. This presents a major contradiction between his words and actions, since there really is nothing stopping him from simply walking away. Despite Chad saying that he was keeping a close eye on him, Ethan is not being held against his will and is still given the choice later on to go off on his own, but rather decides that he's safer sticking together with the group. However, logic should tell him at that point that the only people who have been attacked or killed are the ones who are in close proximity to Sam and Tara, which means that Ethan is either just really stupid or secretly the killer trying to stay a step ahead of everyone else. Of course, we also have his inconsistent tone and character, as he starts off in good standing, only only to shift into a negative gear when he posits the validity of the internet rumors against Sam. And while Ethan is never able to shake this negative tone, as practically every character has lost trust in him by the time we near the climax, there's still the glaring issue of him rescuing Mindy after she's been stabbed by Quinn on the subway. As improbable as this storytelling may be, this still occurs way past the point in the movie where we've already been given enough clues that incriminate him. Therefore, it's best to take anything that happens in the third act with a giant grain of salt, as we're close enough to the killer reveal that it shouldn't matter anyway. Having said that, this entire sequence cheats the audience, which in a way undermines the integrity of the Predictive Killer edit. But considering that so much of the characterization of these killers is told to us rather than shown, it suggests that it might just be the style of the Scream 6 writers to have things occur off screen and then explain them in passing later on. And while this is still a practice that is exercised for Detective Bailey regarding his relationship with Quinn, he's arguably the easiest killer to spot out of the three of them, since he makes the cardinal mistake of throwing shade on a returning character who has previously been established as a fan favorite. As I had mentioned before, Kirby came into the movie with a positive tone and did absolutely nothing suspicious that should incite Detective Bailey to feel he couldn't trust her. Further to that, this isn't even done for the benefit of the other characters, as nobody else is around when he asks his associate to look into Kirby's file. This should remind us that movies don't always present us with a reliable narrative, and we should always trust our intuition before we take anything at face value, especially when it comes to a murder mystery. Common sense would tell us that Detective Bailey in this scene is proving the expression true that whoever smelt it dealt it, meaning that he's actually projecting his own guilt as the killer, and that it's Kirby who should be looking into his background, as that would have been the key in figuring out that he was not only Richie's father, but also the killer, just by virtue of creating this fake identity. It goes without saying that this presents him with an inconsistent tone, but this is fueled even more by his lack of urgency regarding Quinn's presumed safety. If there's even the insinuation for a reason to take better precautions, they need to follow this up with swift action, and watch out for those crocodile tears as well, since Detective Bailey seems to get over his grief in a suspiciously short amount of time, which should leave the audience to question how sincere he's actually being towards the other characters. Next up is the Apathetic Friend. However, I would also say that there are no characters in Scream 6 who fall under this type either. This is somewhat unusual for a Scream movie, as there's always at least one character who displays a passive indifference towards their own well-being as well as the safety and survival of the other people around them. But considering that this movie stockpiled most of its characters into the last two categories, it kind of goes to show that the Apathetic Friend is necessary, as their overall negative attitude actually distracts from the tonal inconsistencies of the other characters, making the eventual killer less obvious to figure out. After that, we have the hidden in plain sight characters, and again, Scream 6 takes a much different approach here. Typically, these are the minor characters in the periphery whose inclusion in the movie is to be expected, as they're the parents, students, school faculty, members of the press, and police deputies who weave in and out of the action without the audience ever learning any personal content about them. In other words, they show up to either get killed, deliver exposition that moves the story along, or perform the duties of their job and nothing more. The only killer in the franchise thus far who has fallen under this type is Mrs. Loomis, and her edit in Scream 2 did a really good job at deflecting all attention away from her and putting it right back onto Gale. In that regard, this killer should be a character who at least has some reoccurring role throughout the story. But the only one in Scream 6 who makes more than one appearance is Dr. Christopher Stone. Of course, he is killed in his second scene, so he doesn't remain a suspect for long, but the fact that he effectively ends his doctor-patient relationship with Sam right from the get-go should be an indicator that he's not the killer. Had this interaction concluded in a more positive and open-ended manner, I might have kept him on the suspect list, as the topic of the internet rumors that keep swirling around Sam would be a very specific detail that directly links back to their conversation. For everyone else, including the likes of Frankie and Brooks, these are all characters who have been designed to appear in one scene, where they either die immediately, show up too late, and in most cases aren't even relevant enough for us to be told what their name is. This is a huge departure from the previous entries, as almost every role, no matter how small it was, still served a function in the grand scheme of the plot. Obviously, it goes without saying that these minor characters in Scream 6 could never turn out to be the killer, as it probably wouldn't bode well for audiences if the mastermind Ghostface was revealed to be the unseen man in the bathtub all along. In any event, that still goes to show us that all of these archetypes are necessary, as this movie's lack of character diversity is most likely the reason that it's been heavily criticized for having a weak mystery and killer reveal. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm adding a new category called the opening scene victim, which are characters that I had previously nullified for the simple fact that, other than Tara in Scream 5, these are characters who are already dead before we can even start to analyze any of the suspects. Just for clarity though, the rules don't actually apply to Jason, as he was a character who was introduced to us as a Ghostface, therefore bypassing the entire function of the Predictive Killer edit. However, we should take into consideration the future possibility that the opening scene victim could be a fake-out death who remains absent for most of the movie, only to be revealed as the killer in the climax. Honestly, this is something I hope never happens, as I can't see any scenario where this plays out effectively, but the writers of the last two movies have shown us that they're not afraid to take risks with the opening scene structure, so I don't want to completely rule this out either. With that said, if this were to happen, there are two things that we'll need to be looking out for. Firstly, is the kill or phone call being performed in front of a crowd? Similar to the idea of show don't tell, an opening scene victim who is isolated to a single setting location probably won't be staging their death, as that would require them to put on a performance for absolutely nobody but themselves. However, if there is another person with them or a crowd of people to witness the spectacle, you might want to keep this character on your list of suspects. Secondly, their death is going to be a major inciting event for the rest of the movie, and the characters will probably reference this person a lot in order to keep the audience cognizant of their importance to the plot. Historically, the opening scene victims in Screams 1 through 4 were rarely referenced beyond the first act of the movie, as their deaths became an afterthought while the body count continued to grow. Since there would need to be a strong basis for this character's motive when they are eventually revealed as the killer, this is someone whose relationship to the hero should be built up by dialogue consistently throughout the film. In terms of applying this theory to Scream 6, since Laura is a character who more or less becomes irrelevant halfway through the opening scene, it can definitely be assumed that she's not the killer, as nobody besides Jason seems to have any idea who she even is. I want to thank a few of my Patreon supporters, like Steve, Michelle, and Josh Carr. If you want to see even more Scream-related content, including the full guide to the Predictive Killer edit, you can check out these videos right over here. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.